My name is Brock, and this is the Dungeon Master's Toolkit Podcast. On this episode, we talk about pro GMing, shared worlds, and there are some fun homebrew monsters and encounters at the end of the episode. Welcome, everybody. Today I have Jesse T. William with me. Welcome, Jesse.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Jesse, why don't you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got started in tabletop role-playing games?
Yeah, so Jesse T. William. I'm very much a music person. I have a degree in audio production and engineering. So how I got started in tabletop role-playing, it was actually through my very dear friend who I met in college for music. So I had started listening to Critical Role back in like 2017 or 2018. Yeah, probably 2017. And in January of 2018, I met up with my friend who I hadn't seen in a while, and we both just started kind of talking about D&D, which neither of us knew the other had interest in. And so like within a couple of weeks, he had got a group together, and I was going down to, so he lives in a different city, I was going down to his city like once every 2 weeks, making these huge trips because I had weekends off just to play D&D. And then like very quickly after that, I started getting into DMing myself because I just had too many thoughts about Dungeons and Dragons. And then slowly over the course of 3.5 years or so it's been since then, it's just consumed my life.
I assume you started with 5th edition then?
Yeah, 5th edition.
And have you branched out to any other systems, or is that kind of the main system that you play in right now?
Yeah, as far as for me, it's just been 5th edition. I've taken a look at Pathfinder 2nd edition. I have the book, and it seems a bit too crunchy for my liking. And I'm also like at this point, extremely familiar with the 5th edition rule set, and I have a pretty good grasp on it because what I mainly do in my games is a lot of homebrew, so a lot of my time is invested in understanding it.
And you mentioned that you do pro GMing. Would you like to chat about that?
Yeah. So I am a professional GM. I'm on startplaying.games. Currently I have, I want to say like 11 or 12 of my 16 games running. So basically my gimmick for the thing is that I run 3 different settings, and in each setting, it has multiple player groups participating in like one large story. So for example, in my largest one, I have 6 of the 8 campaigns going, and each player group is in a different part of the setting and picking up on the same stories. Like, actually, it's really exciting this week, or actually tonight, I'm doing a little like backstory crossover because I found a point in the lore where 4 different players would have been in the same town before they got to the places they were. So I'm running just a little narrative one-shot for them tonight. But then this coming weekend, the first 2 groups who are playing in that setting are going to like meet and start like for the next 5 weeks having like these crossover sessions, which is really, really exciting. Yes, that's the gist of what I do.
And how did you get started in the pro GMing scene?
Back in like November or December of last year, I had just quit working a cafe job, which had like ruined my body. I struggled with, eating and things like that. And I wanted to get back into composing because when the pandemic started, I had just started to be a professional composer, and then all the films I was supposed to work on fell apart. So I had this connection to like get in with some like film students or animation students and compose for them. And I was just hoping for anything. But then I started seeing this start playing advertisement. It's like, oh, do you want to play in a game? Do you have trouble finding games? And I was like, no, but I want to get paid to run games. So I looked into it, and by the end of December, I was like fully invested. I started like figuring out all of these like templates for games to post. And I like wrote my very first session, not knowing like what to expect because I didn't have any players yet. And then it was just like a really, maybe grueling is a bit of an intense words to describe it, but it was a really difficult experience going from not having a job and running off savings to try to do this pro DMing thing to the point where I am now, where I'm like making more than enough money and I'm very much supporting myself. But like I started off in my first game started running in February, so I had like 5 or 6 weeks, maybe more, that my schedule was just like I had it all filled up as far as like what I wanted to do, but like no one was joining. And that game was bi-weekly on Tuesdays, which is still running now. And my first sort of approach, I'm someone who the reason I am very invested in D&D is because I think a lot. I have a lot of creative energy, and D&D has been like and tabletop role playing games have been a wonderful outlet for that. So I came up with like maybe 14 different concepts for campaigns, and the idea is that I would have, I think, all of them bi-weekly and just 7 games a week and sort of like alternating, and I'd have this like just vast assortment of like different things I was running. And then I very quickly, not quickly, over time, I realized that most people weren't interested in bi-weekly games. So around, I want to say like May or June, I switched over to weekly, and games slowly began to fill up. And then I had a couple of videos get some attention on TikTok, and I got a huge influx of players just from happenstance scrolling through the website, and a couple from TikTok. And then I was only really stable come this September. And then just recently, I've had another huge influx of players from another video I made on TikTok talking about how I run games with like multiple groups in each setting and the sort of connected stories.
How long does a typical campaign for you last?
So for the campaign I'm running, or I would say the main campaign, because really like the question is however long the story is supposed to last. So for the main campaign I'm running, which is called In the Hope That We Are Loyal, the story is about like a country with a lot of different like factions and political interests and religious groups falling into corruption about 60 years after they were freed from, the thumb of this empire that was ruling over them. And the story there is extremely big because the players will experience like I mean, I don't want to spoil anything in case my players listen or in case any new potential players listen, but they're going to experience a lot. And so I expect, it's already been running. The first campaign started, I want to say back in like April. I would expect like another 6 to 8 months, if not more, just in this setting. And then the story will continue on into another setting and like a second campaign for any players who want to continue on with their characters and like get them to level 20, or people who want to like start new characters. But then, in another setting, which is starting at like 10th level, the story I envision is much shorter. It might last another like 4 or 5 months, and it's been going on for a lot less of a time. It started back up in August. So yeah, again, it really depends on like what is right for the story.
Sure. And so when you're setting up these settings, you know that you'll have potentially multiple parties that will be playing in this setting at the same time, right? I'm kind of curious how you set that up on Start Playing. Is that like you set up to say, hey, I have like a party in this setting that's available, and maybe I have like 3 parties, or do you have just one big like pool of 15 people or whatever? How does that look?
So each game, so basically for Start Playing, you create templates and sort of like create a campaign from the template. So the template is just a description of like what the content of the game is in vague terms, and then a campaign is just like the specific game that people can join. So in the case of this In the Hope That We Are Loyal game, the sort of biggest game, I've just made 8 campaigns from that template, posted them in different time slots, and given all of them different subtitles for depending on like what part of the setting they're going to be playing in. And then as far as the average, like as far as if you were to look at the game posting, you wouldn't know that it is a part of larger story. Like if you just came in from the website, I find most people don't even read through the whole descriptions of the games. Because for example, in the description, it'll tell you what level the party is starting at, and I don't think I've had a single person who's joined the game in the last like 2 months not ask me what level the game was starting at. So yeah, from the player perspective, they don't know what they're getting into, but also most of the players I've had join in the past like month and a half or so, or maybe less, have mostly come in from TikTok, knowing what it was about. And then there's the occasional player who comes in the session 0 or session 1, depending on when they join. I just say, hey, by the way, and like this is what's going on in the setting, and there are other player groups, and then they really resonate with that. I think that's cool.
Do you have like a Discord server or something where all of the players that are in your game can kind of get together and chat with each other, or is it just mostly facilitated but like between group chat just through you?
For the largest setting, for the In the Hope That You're Loyal setting, I do have a Discord for both, although I haven't executed this concept extremely well, for the campaign players, so everyone who is involved. And then also what I've been trying to do is, I mean, trying might be a bit of a overstatement on the efforts I've put into it so far, but I've set it up so that non-campaign players can join who like can't afford to be a part of the games and sort of interact with the story and the setting as well, and like have an option to make a character and join one of the main factions in the setting who are dealing with the central sort of issue in the setting. But I only really had, I've had one of my main players make a non-campaign character for that, and then I just had my first completely non-campaign player submit their backstory in that server. But for the other two settings, which only have 4 games potentially scheduled in them, there's not as, I mean, it's still interconnected, and the parties will still eventually meet and have crossovers, but the way it's interconnected, I don't think calls for that kind of attention. But I will be, I think, very shortly collecting just all of my players across settings in a Discord, just so it's easier for me to manage like messages and communication, and also just create a bit of community for them of everyone who's experiencing my world and the different settings, and comparing like how different the tones and games and bits of lore are.
Yeah, that makes sense. And keeping everything to one Discord server definitely makes it easier. I know for me, jumping between different social media platforms can be a pain, trying to find new people to interview and stuff like that. So even multiple Discord servers can be hard to manage.
Yeah, yeah. Right now, with the exception of the players who are in that like largest setting, the In the Hope That We're Loyal setting, for all of the other game groups, I have just like a very small Discord just to collect the players for them to communicate with each other. And I am starting to fall behind on keeping track of their messages, which honestly, like, I don't think I really need to do when they're talking amongst themselves. It's not the end of the world, but yeah, just a minor adjustment, I suppose, in the involvement for myself there.
And what has your experience been with the Start Playing Games? I haven't seen it before, so I'm a little new to this.
Yeah, it's been from like the website standpoint. They do a whole lot to like take care of their GMs, and they have a Discord server. And, like, there's tons of people who like are out there offering advice, and they have a bunch of like pages on their website of like, here's the best practices, and you can schedule a time with the people who run it for them to like take you through the same sort of information. That being said, back in December when I tried to do that, admittedly it was like around Christmas, so I think I ended up scheduling like 1 to 3 meetings that all sort of got canceled because of different like vacation things that the person I was scheduling with them were doing. And I ended up just figuring it out on my own. So as far as the like website side of things, it's great. The player side of things, with sort of just like unrestricted access to all of the potential players, you very quickly realize that there are so many people who just like think they can join any game, and that their experience of and their preference for the games they want to play in are sort of standard, and you have tons of like player entitlement. I had this one instance where, and this drove me up the ding dang wall. I had an instance of a player, or rather 2 players, but they joined sort of together, who joined the game the day that a session 0 was scheduled. So before they joined, I wasn't planning on running anything, but you have to sort of keep things on your schedule so that people can come in. So they joined the game, like, I think an hour or 2 before the session was going to start. I think I was going to talk to like one other person that day. And so I had already sort of like had to scramble to get a different session 0 running that day for different players. And we go through session 0, and I'm sort of like, hey, sorry, I'm just a bit frazzled. I was just talking a lot about a different setting. And then, this scheduled time is a completely different thing. And yeah, so, but I went through it, and I gave the ideas, and they talked about what they wanted. And I was like, okay, at the end of the session, I was like, cool. So I'll send you guys a little lore dump of what is going to be relevant to your characters and how you're involved in the narrative, blah, 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 blah. And they didn't, and I sent them the lore dump and didn't respond, which, like, no one has to. Like, people are busy. I don't have any, needs or expectations for how players need to respond as long as they're participating in the games in a way that they enjoy. I told all the players in that session, which was 3 at the time, that in 2, no matter what, we'll start. If we have another player by next week, then we'll start that week. Because typically, whenever I've started a game, I've found that just through luck and happenstance, or bad luck rather, one player is going to leave for some reason, whether it be a schedule change, they can never actually commit to a paid D&D game, medical issue comes up, something always comes up. So 2 weeks go by. We have 3 players join, so we have a potential of 6. And these first 2 players don't show up to the session. And it's like, okay, like maybe they forgot, whatever, but there's nothing I can do about that. They've been charged, they've seen the notifications, so hopefully next session comes, and an hour and 20 minutes into the session, so 20 minutes after they have been charged, the guy messages me and he's like, hey, I've been charged but I haven't played. Is there anything I can do about that? And I was like, well, no. Like, you knew when it was scheduled, if you knew that you couldn't make it, or if you've forgotten about it, like, that's kind of on you. You have the option to skip, you have the option to leave. And this guy started going off, and he revealed in his messages that from the start, he did not want to play. After the session 0, he was not interested in playing the game, but he did not leave. He did not skip any sessions. And I was like, so how is this my fault, my guy? So that's not a very common experience, but you do get those kinds of people who just I don't even know how to describe it. It's just a lot of entitlement. But the vast majority of the player experience I've had on there, of the people who've just stumbled across my games, has largely been great. Some of my favorite people who I've ever played with have just happened to join through those games, like that very first Tuesday game that I was running. Some of my favorite players, and one of them who was, like, at the time completely new to D&D, and it just took to it so well, and such a wonderful role player, and has just these great moments. So it's a mixed bag, but tends, I would say, towards positivity, at least in my subjective experience.
How long, I don't know if you mentioned this, how long have you been doing the pro GMing?
Yeah, so I started back I started getting, like, looking into it back in December of 2021. And then my first game started in February of 2022, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, so what recently, but also we're getting to the end of the year as well, so.
Yeah, just last night I passed 100 paid games run.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So as far as players go, with anything where you're publicly facing, you're going to have a lot of good people and you're going to have some bad experiences as well. I was going to ask, as far as the just kind of the structure of how the games work. So is it when they pay as a player, they pay per session and then also per player, I assume?
Yes, per session, per player. Yeah.
And are you okay with me asking, like, what you typically charge for a session? You don't have to answer if you don't want to.
Oh, no. It's all good, because a lot of people, it's a little frustrating on the TikTok side of things, because a lot of people, like, will ask this question a lot, and not that it's frustrating in the sense that I want to be private about my money, but there are people who are, like, really interested in becoming paid GMs who don't want to, like, look into it all, because, like, they could have, if someone's, like, getting invested, they could have just gone to my games and seen. But right now I'm charging 20 American dollars per player per session. Start playing takes a little bit of that. So I think I'm left with like 18 or something. So I typically have, or I right now in my games, I have 6 potential spots open, but I might expand that to 7. But I also, one of the things I discovered is I think that my games are worth more than that. I had a game back when I was doing the bi-weekly things with a bunch of different settings that was set at 25. And then when I started to get more players, I set some games to 30, just based off of, like, the amount of work involved. And I realized that like unless you have a lot of, what's the word? Not authority, but if unless you're known or you have like a lot to back it up, like you can show the 100 games, you can't really charge that much. So I've set my prices to $20 per session, and then when the next series of campaigns comes around, as this first series like begins to end, I'll eventually raise my prices to around 25 or 30.
Sure. And I assume you'll probably have some repeat players that would come back specifically for your games.
I would hope so. I have a lot of players who are really excited about the world and the lore and love my GMing style. So I would hope, that they would come back, and hopefully that the raising of the prices is still within their price point and they find it reasonable to pay. But if I discover that it's not the case, maybe I'll be stuck at $20 per session per player.
And you said that you typically have about 6 players. Is that right? Per session?
Yeah, or six potential spots. Not every game is full, of course, but when they do fill up, 6 players, yes.
That's kind of your limit. And then how long does a individual session take? Is that 2, 3 hours?
Yeah, for the most part, it's around 3 hours, depending on my own availability for that specific day and the style of play of the players. I will sometimes go into 4 hours. For example, my two of my Saturday games. So one of them, which is going to start crossing over with in that setting with another group. They're like really good role players. They're really good at sort of like creating space for fun and for themselves. So almost every session, rather than 3 hours, it will go all the way to 4 hours right into the front end of the next game on my schedule. But I don't find I have that experience with most of my player groups. Most of my player groups, although they're different levels of role play and most of them are certainly good and just don't take up that much time, and typically it's a comfortable 3 hours.
And how long does it take you to prep for your games?
I've gotten so there's two sort of answers to this. One is that it's taken the past 3.5 years to prep for my games, and the other is that each individual session at this point, especially so, there's a bunch of answers to this, and they're all I find really at least fun for me to think about. But for example, with the largest setting that I'm running, with the 8 potential games, the 6 active games, the stories are extremely interconnected. And for example, like the sort of inciting incident that kicked off all of the other plots in the game happened in that first campaign. Essentially, like the story from the setting point of view that the average person would hear is that there's this place called the Cloud Tower, and there are like 3 to 4 different factions there that represented like different parts of the guards, which is like pretty common for that part of the setting. And there was a clique that arose that was not, divided into factions, but rather the factions divided amongst themselves, regrouped into 2 groups, and then fought each other, which is just like extremely strange because the factions that were involved were like 2 of them were like major religious factions with like strict kind of beliefs and strict kind of like rule sets to follow. And the sort of like splitting off was a huge betrayal of that. And so there's this rumor that, that was a cult, and the side that won is like spreading this like, cult problem across the land. And so the inciting incident for all of the other parts of the setting is how do, it's the elves begin to respond to that. How do the halflings, how do the dwarves and the orcs and the dragonborn in the north, like, how does that ripple through the setting, and how does it continue to arise with the different factions and yada yada yada. So for planning those sessions, which I think just in that setting I've probably run like 40-50 games, at this point I just structure out like what is happening in the world. I have a pretty good understanding of that. I write down a loose structure of events for the players to follow, but I largely just improvise the sessions. So each session might take anywhere from like 20 minutes to 2 hours to plan, and then I just kind of let the players take the lead because I just have this like extremely strong understanding of the intricacies of this setting, and then like the logistics of my world and how to respond to the players. And then for the other settings, we'll typically take maybe anywhere from like 30 minutes to 2 hours, typically on the longer end, but as campaigns. So I'm starting a new campaign tomorrow in one of the settings, and I'll have to plan that one today, and that will take maybe like 2-3 hours, just because the first sessions are always the hardest. You need to I always do sort of like narrative vignette to introduce each character and sort of weave their stories together and have an inciting incident for the campaign, and to think of a way to make that engaging, to set the players up to be invested in the rest of the campaign will always take longer. So yeah, there's that. And then there's, of course, as I mentioned, like I've been doing this for only 3.5 years, which isn't a lot of time, but in the pandemic, all I did was D&D. I spent so much time world building, and again, I have this brain that constantly needs output. And so I just invested so much into this world, and to the point where if I needed to, I could like run a 6 TED talks, each an hour long, about different parts of my world, and I could improv like probably like 2 or 3 sessions in like any given part of the world, depending on the time period. So yeah, it's like the biggest thing that's allows me to do this is just how much I think about D&D and how much I have thought about D&D, and the like years and years of just like understanding of the world that I've built in.
Do you find that having homebrewed all of it helps you to just keep all of that top of mind?
I would think so. From the very start, there's never a moment when I started homebrewing my worlds where I wanted to where I found the idea of running someone else's content appealing at all. Like I was so adverse to even looking at other settings. So yeah, I found that because I have created all of this content, and I also have a very good and long memory, I think that definitely helps me keep my ducks in a row. And like, yeah, certainly.
And do you use like what kind of resources do you use when you're running a game? Like, do you have maps and battle maps or music, that sort of thing?
So I run everything in Theater of the Mind. I don't have music currently. I've been looking into Sirenscape a little bit. So just recently I had my first proper week off since I started this whole thing. And I wanted to look into Sirenscape, but my social engagements took up way too much time. But yeah, so I want to start getting invested in Sirenscape, but otherwise things completely in Theater of the Mind. Again, I sort of have this unique kind of, I don't know, not brain, but I'm very good at visualizing things in a sort of 3D sense. Like I know different people have different sort of like, yeah, I'm not sure if you know what like aphantasia is, but that's the kind of thing where people can't visualize, like they don't see anything in their mind's eye. And then I have like the absolute opposite of that, where I can like see things in 3D in my mind's eye. So I'm able to like, I picked up sketching at the beginning of the pandemic as well, and I got very good at it very quickly because I can kind of see into the page and create those lines. So I've gotten a lot of compliments on how I am able to keep track of things and keep things like comprehensible in Theater of the Mind. The only thing that I do have, although I have tons of maps that I've painted that I provide like resources for on the different discords, and I'll like, whenever it comes up, I'll send a little picture of like, where the players are at, or put little dice down on the map to be like, here are the things that you're looking at with the titles and everything. I do have my world map on my Zoom calls always behind me, just as like a background, because it kind of looks nice, and I hope would give these players a sense of like scale and how they fit into the larger world and this small piece of history in this.
That makes sense. You mentioned that you do sort of a narrative introduction in your first sessions with players. Do you want to explain that a little bit more on kind of how you set those up?
Yeah, for sure. So my focus with games is to tell like player focused narrative driven stories. So even from the setup, I try to get players like with a backstory that will invest them in the setting and tie them into the setting, give them personal stakes. And then when I write first sessions, I will give each player a sort of spotlight to have an interaction with something about the world, give them an initial direction or an initial, I don't know, like something. It's really highly dependent on each player. And eventually sort of like essentially hand them a thread that will get tangled up in the other players' threads as well as the sort of greater story. So for example, for tomorrow, the premise for the setting is that in this place about 5 years ago, they had this country had thrown out this occupying draconic empire, and they have invited adventurers from outside of the land to come join. And so the pitch for the campaign is, okay, like you're coming to join or coming to like explore this land and see what opportunities are there for you, but also what is something that you might need from this land. So typically it'll be something of an arcane nature. So wizardly secret or something of a divine nature. So only something that gods who are present or worshipped rather in this setting can solve. Something of a druidic nature. So something wrong with the land in your setting or the place that you're from, that answers can be found in this setting potentially. So players come up with like, here's the thing that's wrong, and I'm resetting a bit. So they figure out something that like works for them as a point of interest, and then I will tie that to something within the setting. So, for example, in this specific setting, along with the draconic kind of issue that is still resonant within the setting, among with like, hundreds of other, not hundreds, but dozens of other things. 50 years ago in a neighboring land, there was this abyssal incursion. It brought this other land low, and then they've just started to rebuild, and the remnants of this abyssal incursion are fleeing that land and making their way into this new one. And a couple of the players in this new campaign have ties to that abyssal incursion. So one of the players was like exiled from that initial land and had to like, their family had to live through this incursion that happened 50 years ago. And then another player, there's this like disease that is affecting like a family member of theirs that they just can't find a cure for, and that will be tied up with that same incursion and how it's kind of spreading through adjacent lands. Yeah, so it's just like tying them into or handing them those initial threads to those like very, very large overarching problems, but giving them a very small piece of it to deal with. Because one of the things I like to focus on about storytelling, and one of the things I perhaps am maybe critical of in other stories and other pieces of media, is I really hate when the stakes are the whole world is going to end. So when I create stories for the players and involve them in the stories, I try to give them just a small piece, but make that piece feel important and feel personal.
Yeah, I agree with that in storytelling, because you can only have, the universe be in danger so many times before it starts to feel a little old. Whereas
Yeah.
the like more personal survival stories, or like you said, like if you're trying to find a cure for your mom or whatever, is very important to that character, but not necessarily world ending to everybody else.
Yeah, exactly.
How do your players build characters? Is that done kind of outside of the game and then brought into the game, or do you do character building as a group in like a session 0?
That it really depends on how quickly a game comes together and how much time everyone has. So for the most part, as far as the character building, like creating the mechanical character, I just provide the bare minimum sort of like advice. I have all the most of the resources on D&D Beyond, so if they want any of those resources or access to them, I'll provide that. But in large part, I leave it. I put faith in my players and let them take care of it. Even to the point of like different rolling methods, like whether it's standard array, point buy, or rolling, as long as no one's coming in the game with like broken stats, I'm fine with it. The only thing I focus on as far as character creation is those narrative ties, those backstories, because that is the focus of the games. Although like I do run combats and I homebrew a bunch of creatures, and I do enjoy combat and having like complex mechanics associated with it. I'm inclined to say that combat is secondary, but it's not like but it's in a I don't know, it's a weird way to describe it, but almost in like a spiritual sense, it comes secondary. Yeah, does that make sense at all?
I think so. Do you have a favorite homebrew creature that you've made?
Ooh, I have a
Now,
lot.
now you
So
have to pick.
yeah. It really comes down to storytelling of the creature. So, for example, the one of the things in that main setting, there are these creatures from a place in my homebrew world called the Infernal Side of the Feywild, which it belongs to the god of lies. And so all of the creatures that I've homebrewed for that setting, which by the way, most of them are available on my Patreon, and this next month I'm going to put like a huge post of just a compendium of a bunch of things I've made, including classes and whatnot. But the storytelling of all these creatures is like, how does a creature that is made of deceit, what does that look like, and what is the story with that? So I have a favorite story of or favorite creature from a like prescriptive story, and then I have a favorite encounter that players have had with a one of these creatures. So there's one called the Eyeless Imposter. And the story of this creature is that it is a deeply insecure creature that like desperately want like a sense of companionship or family. And so what it does is it will find like an isolated group of people, whether it be a family who lives in a cabin in like isolated woods or like a distant guard outpost, and it will lurk around the people for 24 hours, and once it's done that, the people are considered charmed by it. So it will select one of the people and it will kill them, and then it will remove all of the other creatures' eyes, so that they cannot behold what it is. And it will like telepathically speak to these people, and these people will believe that it is their family member, whatever. And because they're all blind, the eyeless imposter will begin to like take care of them. But because it's like a infernal inhuman creature, it doesn't exactly know what to do. So it will like, make them eat food that it might not be edible, or might not be food at all, and make them like extremely sick. And eventually, like when things don't go its way, when these people are getting sick, and this feeling of like family begins to diminish, it just kills them. And so it provides a very, very fun narrative structure for players to engage with, where like typically they will discover the body first of the person who had been killed. Maybe there's a way to identify who it is. If it's like they will find the outpost, and they will find the guards without these eyes, who are just kind of chilling, like, hey, like, something happened to my eyes. I can't see, but it's okay. Our friend, whatever their name is taking care of us, but you don't see that friend. And there's just like this deeply unsettling feeling that grows until they come across the eyeless imposter. And my favorite thing about this is mechanics involved. Although the creature is not powerful, it has like 40 hit points. I had players encounter it, and the paladin one-shotted it at like 3rd level. The only way to properly kill it, when it dies, or when it drops to 0 hit points, it will kind of curl up into a fetal position, cover its eyes with its hands, and dig its these long claws into its head. And the players, in order to get rid of it, need to wrench those hands free. And the creature itself like does not have eyes, but if you cut where eyes would be, there are empty sockets. You face the like empty sockets towards its victims, and it will like scream and disappear and fade into nothing. So it really plays up on this idea that this creature is like ashamed of what it has done, and like just the witnessing of what it has truly done like destroys it. So that's my favorite thing that I've come up with. And then my favorite story, so there's a much simpler creature just called the Deceitful Traveler. And the mechanics of this, I mean, it's not really even mechanics, it's just a story, which is, this is a green-skinned satyr with orange crystalline horns, which is sort of the theme of like the tieflings and most of the devils who come from this infernal side of the Feywild. And essentially the whole point of this creature, which is more of an NPC, is just to lead the party or the people into the most dangerous situation possible, while ingratiating themselves and learning as much about the world that they can, so that they can learn about other dangerous places to lead people to. So I had this Deceitful Traveler at the start of one of my campaigns. So, okay, sorry, I'll back up a bit here. This Deceitful Traveler first appeared in a different campaign, stole some really important things from a player group, and then was the like first NPC a different player group met in their campaign. He led them along for like a couple of sessions and then like fucked them over in a huge way. And as these two player groups are going to cross over, so after they deal with the initial events, both player groups are going to chase this deceitful traveler down and finally deal with them. So that's my favorite story, but still the favorite thing I've created is the Atlas Imposter.
They both sound terrifying. So for the deceitful traveler, do you just like lead them along and then like, oh, here's a really dangerous encounter that it stumbles upon, or?
Yeah, so the idea with the deceitful traveler, and especially in the context of the setting, is that the deceitful traveler being from the plane of lies, and the plane of lies kind of being the major thing that is influencing the events of this setting. Like the deceitful traveler knows about all of the creatures that come through. He like it survived in the plane of lies for its whole life, and it's broken through. And so now it's just spending as much time learning about what is happening in this setting. And so in this setting, about 60 years ago, there's another occupying empire called the Semitic Empire that occupied this land. And then over the course of a month, it just disappeared. Like not in the sense that like the structures disappeared, but like all the people either fled en masse or like were killed. And that was because of the plane of lies and what they had done. And so the deceitful traveler knows this and knows that these abandoned Semitic cities are like filled with all of these like little rifts and these creatures that come through. And so in this case, he had led the party first to an eyeless imposter who he knew that the party would be able to deal with, but then kind of like told the party that he was going to go into this Semitic ruin to like try to get something that was chasing the party off their tail. And he goes in and finds the most dangerous thing he can find and basically lures the party in, steals some of their stuff, and leaves them to die. Of course, they survive because that would be extremely mean if I just killed all the players like that. But yeah, so it's basically the game there is just like knowledge and lying to the players and getting them to trust them by giving, because it's a very knowledgeable creature, giving them genuine, helpful knowledge that they'll never get to use because eventually they'll be led to their deaths. But of course, in this case, they weren't.
That's really cool. I like both of those. They both sound like fun creatures to run.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I have a lot of fun designing creatures. I found the way I go about it, being story focused, creates so many opportunities and makes it so much easier to create things. I really have a passion for it.
And we're about getting to time. So is there anything else that you would like to talk about before we wrap up?
I mean, there's nothing that as far as topics I want to talk about, but I will, if this is the place to plug my stuff, what we've just talked about, the eyeless imposter, the deceitful traveler, as well as a number of other creatures are available on my Patreon. My TikTok, my YouTube are all Jesse G. William. On my YouTube, I talk a lot about a couple of different things. Most of it is just like about my world and concepts in my world and world building. And then by the end of this month, like I mentioned, on my Patreon, I'm going to change the way I do things a little bit. I'm going to just release a compendium of creatures, magic items, and 3 different homebrew classes that I have created.
All right. With that, thank you for joining, Jesse. I had a blast talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Dungeon Master's Toolkit podcast. You can find links to all of the products and resources that we talked about on the show in the show notes. And if you'd like to join the community or find out how to be on the show, check out our subreddit or join us in our Discord server.